Okay, tonight's November 28th. This is our first meeting for reasoning and rhetoric. And what we're going to do tonight is do a flyover of philosophy in general, what it is and how it's supposed to be studied. And then we're going to branch off of that and get into classical reasoning and rhetoric, which are actually one branch of philosophy, even though we don't talk about them like that, but that's what they are. So what I'm going to do is I've got three documents that we're going to walk through or run through tonight. You can download all of these. I'll share I guess I'll share the links later on. Just keep making sure everybody gets in here. But three documents to go over. We're going to start looking at what we talked about last night on arithmetic, just really quick. And then we're going to get into this overview of, let me share my screen. Hold on a sec. Sorry. Fumbling here a little bit. So we're going to start with this document we looked at last night on the Quadrivium from Plato. And then we're going to go through this second document, which is an overview of philosophy, which I think you'll find helpful. And then from there, we're going to jump to this third document, which is an overview of rational philosophy. And by the end of this, I think you're going to be pretty excited because you're going to have a good survey of really the whole classical curriculum from the trivium all the way through the quadrivium and through the philosophical sciences. And you'll really clearly understand why everything is the way it is, how it's all set up, and how it's supposed to be studied. So very practical and helpful. And then in future weeks, we're just going to move week by week through this stuff and do the studies. So we'll kind of map out a plan tonight and then spend, the rest of our lives, I guess, chipping away through this little by little. So last night we talked about the quadrivium and we talked about the mathematical sciences, and I don't know if you all were here last night. I didn't really pay attention to names, unfortunately. But we talked about the quadrivium, the four mathematical sciences, and we explained how Plato argued that they were like steps that lead us from this world of changing, decaying things, distracting, sensible things, into the contemplative realm, as it were, where we ascend to the good. That's the line that he used at the beginning of this passage in Book 7. The best minds must continue to ascend until they arrive at the good. And we talked about what the good is. It's worth knowing that the word God is derived from good. So that's really the idea. It's moving into contemplation and asking, how do we actually do that, right? How do we actually do that? And Plato argues that we make use of the mathematical sciences, not because we're trying to solve problems or learn how to do calculations, but because in abstract senses, they lead us easily is the key. They lead us easily to contemplation. And that's why the ancient philosophers focused on the mathematical sciences. Pythagoras was most famous for this. He was the real champion of mathematical sciences, leading us to wisdom. But Plato makes a subtle little statement at the end, which I highlighted as we finished up last night. It got knocked onto the second page here. But at the end of this long discussion of the mathematical sciences, Plato says, all of this is but the prelude to the actual strain which we have to learn. In other words, the mathematical sciences are great, but they're really just a warm-up for the real study, the real ascent to the good, which in Plato's teaching, if you continue reading the Republic, Book 7, he goes on and talks about dialectic. And, it's hard to even get a definition of dialectic today. It's used all the time, but most people that I read writing, most people I hear talking, they really don't understand what dialectic is. So tonight we're going to go through this whole ancient philosophy, and we'll very clearly understand what dialectic is, what he's talking about. And then we'll also move into Aristotelian philosophy to see that Aristotle goes even further than Plato and says, no, that's not it. You're just warming up with dialectic. We've got bigger things to get into. So we'll understand all of that by the end of our time tonight. And my plan here is to go through and show you, after moving through the mathematical sciences, if we follow Pythagoras or if we follow Plato, when we want to move on further, we have to get into the art of reasoning. That's really where this takes us. Now, if you've read Plato, I talk about these things in walk talks, but very, very superficially. You know that the motto of ancient philosophy was "Know thyself," and a very famous motto, ancient philosophy, "Know thyself." But we often hear it, but we don't know the context. It comes from Plato's dialogue, First Alcibiades, which is, if you're going to read Plato's dialogues, that's the first dialogue you should read. You should start with First Alcibiades. That's where, like I said, that's where that motto comes from. And it's really the beginning of philosophy. Know thyself means understand what you are, that you are a creature composed of body and soul. You're not like the animals in the world. You're destined to live forever, and you need to know yourself. You need to know what you are in order to live a properly human life. So that phrase, know yourself, imagine, talking to your kids or your friends, and when they're acting up or, acting foolishly, just giving that motto, you need to know yourself. You need to be what you are. That's the idea of that phrase. Think of your nature, think of what you are, and be what you are. Know yourself. Think about what you're doing, and act as in a manner appropriate for a human being destined for eternity. That's the meaning of that phrase, know yourself. So if you want to read Plato, the place to start is First Alcibiades, and you'll see that it gets into the question of human nature, talks about the soul and the purpose of the human life, all that, lays the foundation for all Platonic philosophy. But we're going to get past that and just go over all of philosophy, because we have to get beyond Plato to Aristotle and eventually into scholasticism to really get through true philosophy. So what I've done here in this document, I'll give you a link real quick. Give me 1 second. Let me get a link here. I'll post it in the chat. If you want to open it up on your side, you can. This is an overview of philosophy, of true philosophy. So this is not something being pulled from ancient writers that's, pagan origin, that needs to be corrected or updated for Christian studies. This is actually adapted by me from St. Thomas's writing. His, down the bottom, you can see it's from his commentary on ethics. Thomas Aquinas's commentaries are available to us. I don't know why people don't read them. You can read his exposition of the philosophical works of Aristotle. They're amazing. They're probably twice as helpful as Aristotle's works are. But in the introduction to the Ethics, he explains the whole system of philosophy, what all the different sciences are, how to study it, what the goal is, and all that. So there's no mystery in any of this. We've got it explained for us by one of the greatest doctors of the church. And once we get this in front of us, once we get this in our head, it's just a matter of us doing it. That's why, in my walk talks and stuff, I criticize, the conference speakers who are always talking about these things. There's nothing to talk about. There's nothing to debate. There's no mystery as to what we're supposed to study. We have to spend our time studying it, not talking about the study itself. And if we start with this map that St. Thomas gives us, we can just focus our attention and our energy and our resources on just making progress in the actual study, which is the real work. So I want to walk through this and make sure this is clear for everybody. And then you'll see the second point down here deals with rational philosophy. That's where we're going to bounce off and get into reasoning and rhetoric. Okay, so that's the plan for tonight, and I'm going to try to blitz through this. So bear with me, and then in future weeks, we'll just continue to refer back to these documents and continue talking about them and getting deeper into this stuff. So bear with me as I fly through this tonight. So to go through an overview of philosophy, and remember, this is all taken from St. Thomas. All I did was take this big chunk of text and I just, removed from it all the filler and distilled it down into the core points. So we're just going to walk through this and I'll do a little commentary as we go along. First of all, when we talk about philosophy, we all know that philosophy is the love of wisdom. We've all heard that. We know the word philosophy means love of wisdom. I think it's better to refer to it as the pursuit of wisdom, because that's really the life of the philosopher. It's a life of the pursuit of wisdom. It's the idea of the lover and the beloved. The lover is in pursuit of the beloved. That's the real illustration of philosophy. We don't possess her yet. We want to possess her. We're seeking her, and she's elusive and difficult to attain. But we're told that if we seek her as for silver, and if we sacrifice everything for her sake, we'll obtain her in the end. And that's the image of philosophy. That's taught in the scriptures. That's from the book of Proverbs. But that's the idea. Philosophy is the pursuit of this woman named wisdom, who we are in love with and desire to be united with forever. So that's the life of the philosopher, the pursuit of this woman, this personification of wisdom itself. That's all great, but we have to know what wisdom is. And St. Thomas gives us this little definition. The thing that's great about St. Thomas is he just it's almost like he burps these little ideas once in a while, and they're profound, and it's like the best explanation anywhere. And it's like a passing note that he makes as he's talking about something else. But he gives this brief little definition of wisdom. He says, wisdom is the perfection of reason. And when you meditate on that, it's a pretty profound statement. Wisdom is the perfection of reason. So reason is given to us by birth. It's a natural faculty. We're all given it. Just like we're all given bones and muscles, it's not developed. It's our responsibility to cultivate it and develop it. And as we develop reason, just like as we develop our physical bodies, as we develop reason, we move towards the perfection or the fulfillment of the end of the faculty of reason. And as we ascend, to take Plato's expression of ascending to the good, what we're really doing is we're taking this faculty of reason that's been given to us in our nature, and we're developing it, and we're cultivating and strengthening and sharpening it, and we're moving towards the perfection of the power that reason actually is capable of. And that's the work of philosophy, pursuing the perfection of reason. And that perfection of reason is what is rightly referred to as wisdom. So what we desire is to study and work to perfect this faculty of reason, to basically fulfill our potential as human beings, to become what God created us to be, which is wise. That's what he intended us to be. He didn't intend us to be strong like oxen and horses. He intended us to be wise, and we become wise through the perfection of that faculty of reason. So philosophy is the pursuit of wisdom. Wisdom is the perfection of reason, fulfilling our potential as creatures made in the image of God, given the faculty of understanding, free will, reason, all of that. It's all the same package. And then we have to ask, well, how do we do this, right? So this is where it gets practical. This is yesterday when I said, if you're ever in a modern college philosophy class and you just think to yourself, this is terrible, what is the point of this class? This is where they go off the rails. They don't actually deal with the purpose of philosophy, which is to lead us to wisdom. They don't teach these things, and it's never practical. It doesn't lead us to happiness, which is what it's supposed to do. We have to understand what wisdom is. We have to understand what reason is, and what the purpose of reason is. What did God actually give us reason for? How do we perfect it? What are we supposed to be doing with this natural power of reason? So St. Thomas tells us that it pertains to reason to know order. It pertains to reason to know order. So what reason is this power, this faculty that God gives to us. And it's like a detection system. It's like a sixth sense that as we go into the world, it recognizes order that exists in the world. So it's this means by which we can recognize God's design in the world and discern God's presence in the world. It's like reason is sort of this sense that God has given us that allows us to start, sniffing the trail, tracking the scent and finding our way back to God if we actually cultivate it and live as human beings rather than animals. That's the choice that we have to make. Reason can identify order in things. And it does so in four different ways. It's responsible for these four different relationships that it has to this concept of order. And just so you know, in the Metaphysics and in other works, Aristotle says it's the duty of the wise man to order things. That's what a wise man does. That's the test of wisdom. But reason, it pertains to reason to know order. And so the question is, well, where do we seek this order? What is this order that we're supposed to look for? And there are four different ways in which reason relates to order. The first one is reason relates to order, which it doesn't establish. So reason doesn't create the order, it simply observes the order. So the order already exists. There already is order, and reason is able to discover and recognize and observe that order. And when we talk about this, we're talking about the order that exists outside of us in the natural world. So the first relation between reason and order is with respect to the order that exists in the natural world around us. So when we say things like God reveals himself through creation, God reveals himself through the natural world, we're talking about this. It's this sense that there is order in the natural world, and the faculty of reason within us, especially as we develop it, it can sense that order. It can recognize that order and bring us by understanding it can guide us into living in harmony with that order, which is part of what wisdom is, as we're going to see in a minute. But the first relationship between reason and order, reason does not establish this order. This is an order that is already established in the natural world, and reason allows us to discern that order in nature. The second relation between reason and order, reason is very unique in that it's able to contemplate itself. So reason can turn upon itself and actually examine itself just as it examines things outside of us. We're able to also examine ourselves. So this second relationship between reason and order has to do with reason contemplating itself and working to order itself. So this is the second kind of order, the ordering of reason itself, the ordering of our thoughts and ideas. This is the second type of order that reason works on. Reason orders itself. The third kind has to do with our will. So this again works on us. It works within us. Reason establishes order in our will. This is the third kind of order, ordering the will. And then lastly, reason orders external things. So, our actual works that exist outside of us, organizing a garden, building a house, doing works outside of our bodies where reason actually is working to plan and establish order in things that are made. So there are four different types of order, and it pertains to reason to know order, and these are the four ways in which it does so. Two of them exist outside of us, that which we observe in the natural world, and that which we establish in our own works. They exist outside of us. And two of these, I guess I can say species or modes of order are within us. The ordering of our own thoughts, the ordering of reason itself, and the ordering of our will. So we've got these four different relations between reason and order. Now, once we get that in our heads, this is where the philosophical sciences come from, because this is what the philosophical sciences are. So if we were to say, what is the curriculum? Is there a true curriculum, or are we free to create our own curriculum? St. Thomas would say, no, you can't create your own curriculum. The curriculum is necessary based on these truths of human nature, the role of reason, the pursuit of wisdom. There aren't 1,000 different things we can study. There aren't 1,000,000 different roads we can take. There's one road, because these things are real. So because there are these four relations between reason and order, these four different relations are pursued through four different philosophical sciences, or four different sciences, I should say. All right. And this is where the philosophical curriculum comes from. It comes from this reality that we're simply seeking to study and understand order in these four different senses. So the first relation, where we observe the order that's established in the natural world, that's what we study in natural philosophy. That's the point of that study. We seek to understand, we seek to discover and know the order that exists in the natural world, the order which God has created and established in nature. That's the study of natural philosophy. We do that through Aristotle's physics, through Aristotle's metaphysics. Metaphysics is also natural philosophy, and other minor works that Aristotle wrote on natural philosophy, like On the Soul, On the Heavens, and so on. Those are minor works on natural philosophy, but we start with physics and metaphysics. And we'll talk about them in our Thursday meeting when we talk about natural philosophy. So Thursday nights, we'll be seeking to discover and understand the order which exists in the natural world. That's the study of natural philosophy. We know what we're supposed to study, we know why we're supposed to study it, and we know the exact books and how we're supposed to study it. So once we know all that, it's just a matter of work, as I said before. That's where I want to get us, to a point where we know what needs to be done, we know what the goals are, we know what the means are. It's just a matter of doing the work and actually achieving those things. So that first relation between order and reason leads us to natural philosophy, which is the science of that order, seeking that order. The second, where reason establishes order within itself by its own self-examination, its own self-contemplation, that's the second branch of philosophy, which is rational philosophy. So in rational philosophy, reason turns on itself and seeks to perfect itself through contemplation by understanding the principles of how it works, which is pretty fascinating to think about. It actually understands itself, discerns its own principles, and then seeks to work to perfect them. We need to study rational philosophy, and the place we go to study that science is Aristotle's Organon. Aristotle's Organon contains the science of rational philosophy. Thirdly, we said the third relation between reason and order has to do with ordering the will. Well, that's why the third branch of philosophy is moral philosophy. In moral philosophy, we seek to study and understand how our will should be ordered, and then work to actually order it according to that wisdom. That's the purpose of moral philosophy. That study begins in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So that's where we start the study of that third branch of philosophy. Now, there's three divisions of moral philosophy here, which are worth knowing. The first is individual ethics, where we seek to order ourselves as individuals and bring ourselves into line with the ends of our individual life. Then there's domestic ethics, which deals with life at the household level, which is the first community in nature. And then thirdly, political science, which deals with ordering the will of the community for the sake of the common good. So we've got three different levels of ethical studies to engage in. Individual ethics, that's where the word monasticism comes from. Monastic life means you devote yourself to the ordering of your own will. That's the purpose of the monastic life. Domestic ethics or household management is the ordering of our household so that our household serves the common good of all of the members of that household. We have a book by a philosopher named Xenophon who lived in the time of Socrates, who wrote a household management work which does that, which explains the moral philosophy at the domestic level. And then political science, obviously, we have Aristotle's Politics, which takes up that study. So that's moral philosophy, the third of the four relations between order and reason. And then lastly, mechanical arts. Mechanical arts are where we seek to take this wisdom and apply it to the actual works that we do. So this is where all of this study sort of touches the practical works that we do in the world, whatever those works may be. We seek to understand, to put it in simple Christian terms, what God's will is for these different things we do. I talk about the role of the laity all the time. The mission of the laity, if you look it up in the Catechism, is to order temporal affairs according to God's will. This is what that's talking about. This is the work of the laity, right? To engage in mechanical arts and order them in temporal affairs, to order those affairs according to God's will, because that's wisdom. That's what it means to be wise. That's what we're supposed to be doing as laymen. We're engaging in mechanical arts, whatever they may be, and that doesn't just mean manual labor, so don't oversimplify that. It's any kind of external work that produces something. We're to seek that work that we do is in harmony with everything else, with natural philosophy, with rational philosophy, with moral philosophy. It's all one thing. It's all one, or I should say, it's all just four different parts of what it means to be wise. So to engage in mechanical arts doesn't mean you're allowed to be a dodo and just like leave off studies. You can't engage in mechanical arts intelligently as a human. You can't do human works unless you do them according to reason. And so all of these studies, they can't be separated. And one of the goals of these studies is to actually engage in temporal affairs and direct them according to wisdom, according to God's will. So when you put all those four things together, natural philosophy, rational philosophy, moral philosophy, and mechanical arts, which are our temporal professions, that's the life of wisdom. All of those things together. That's the life of wisdom. You can't leave any out. You can't leave out moral philosophy and engage in mechanical arts. That wouldn't make any sense. It's all four of them together. All right, so that's a flyover, as I said. That's a flyover of philosophy. Okay, so we can see what the philosophy curriculum is. It's not just a bunch of random books that these guys were printing. Aristotle wasn't just sitting down saying, I'd really like to write a book about ethics. That would be cool. I think there's a market for a book on ethics. Maybe I'll work. That's not what Aristotle was doing. Aristotle had this whole system in his head, and he was working through this system to investigate these necessary sciences and write the content of these sciences and put a whole system of philosophy together. And that's what he did. St. Thomas is the one who sort of discovered the plan of that whole thing and explained it to everyone. And that's why we find these explanations in the writings of St. Thomas. So we've got our whole curriculum for philosophy laid out in front of us. If we want to pursue wisdom and bring reason to its perfection, we've got to deal with these four different orders that reason is responsible to engage with. The order in the natural world, the order in our own reason, in our own soul, the order of our will, and the order in the mechanical works or the temporal affairs that we engage in. We want to order all of these things according to wisdom, and that's the purpose of the human life. Now, obviously, different people can pursue these things to different degrees, and that's how the social order sort of sorts itself out, right? So we can understand that. You can understand why in Aristotle's time, slavery was considered necessary, because there were people who were capable of mechanical work. They were capable of mechanical arts, but they weren't capable of planning those works. So it was understood that a wise man needed to plan the works, and others who couldn't plan needed to contribute by actually engaging in those works and bringing them to fulfillment. That was how they contributed to the good of society. So anyway, that's a flyover of philosophy that lays out the whole philosophy curriculum for us. And we'll talk about that more on Wednesday and Thursday night as we actually get into moral philosophy and rational and natural philosophy. Tonight, though, we're going to focus on rational philosophy. If you look in that document, you'll see there's a link right in it here. It says, see the overview of rational philosophy. You could probably click that link and open up the next document. So keep this in mind, though, right? We just did this flyover of philosophy. The second of the 4 sciences is rational philosophy. Tonight, we're talking about reasoning and rhetoric. So we're going to talk about that second philosophical science. So understand the plan and what we're doing tonight, okay? Because we're going to fly over rational philosophy tonight. That's what we're doing here, right? So let's check out an overview of rational philosophy, and yeah, good. I see everybody's on here. Okay. So we see that the second philosophical science is rational philosophy. So now we've got to go and ask, okay, so what do we need to do, right? How do we pursue this knowledge of rational philosophy? Well, St. Thomas takes care of us again, and he provides this whole overview. You can see down in the footnote, I say, this is adapted from Thomas Aquinas's commentary on posterior analytics. St. Thomas wrote a commentary on Aristotle's posterior analytics, and you'll understand what that is in just a minute if you don't know already. And in that foreword, St. Thomas explains the whole system of rational philosophy. So there's, again, no mystery, no uncertainty, what we're supposed to study, what should be in the schools, and so on. It's all explained for us. We just don't do it. That's our problem. So we'll see here as we go through this, the second of these 4 philosophical sciences, rational philosophy, with the whole plan laid out for us. Because, and this is what the most profound part is, Aristotle did all the work. Aristotle did it all. He wrote the whole entire system. He wrote the entire library of philosophical science, from natural philosophy to rational philosophy to moral philosophy, and he even gets into some mechanical arts here and there. But here we're going to look at rational philosophy, and all St. Thomas is doing is explaining to us what Aristotle did, 2,400 years ago, all right? So this is an overview of that second philosophical science, which is rational philosophy. So how do we learn this second philosophical science? Well, here's the plan. We're dealing with reason, and remember, rational philosophy is the science where we actually turn reason on itself and use reason to study reason. So we're seeking to understand the principles of reasoning first, and then we're going to work to order our reason so it actually does what it's supposed to do. It's just like the body. There's a perfect analogy between the body and the soul. If you think about any kind of physical exercise, fitness training, workout, you can't just you don't achieve goals of fitness by just working out or just by working or exercising. There's a process by which we have to learn what needs to be done. We have to learn, what workout should I do? What exercises should I do? What's the proper technique for these exercises? We've got to learn how to exercise first. We've got to learn how the muscles work, how the muscles grow, and so on. We've got to learn all of this technique and strategy. And then after we've learned the technique and strategy, we've got to actually do it. Perfect practice makes perfect. We've got to actually do that intelligent work. The reason and the soul works the same way. We first have to learn how the soul actually works, how reason actually works, get a sense of what needs to be done, and then we need to do it. Then we need to do the work of ordering our soul, as it were, with respect to reason. So we've got to first understand what our soul even does. What does reason actually do? We've got to understand the principles, how it works, what it does. So there are three acts of reason, three things that reason does. Three things that reason does. The first is simple apprehension. Simple apprehension. So we've got five senses. Our five senses are they're just constantly taking in information. And you can see how the senses are how our soul engages with the world outside of us. So our soul is engaging with the world outside of us, with the material world through the senses. And the senses are constantly receiving this information, constantly receiving these impressions from the world, and they're transferring that information to the soul, where impressions or images, as it were, are made in the soul of the things that are perceived by the senses. This is simple apprehension. So you look at a dog, and then you can close your eyes, and you've got an image of that dog stored in the soul. It's almost like photography, where that image burns itself into the film, and it's there. That's what the senses do. You smell an orange, and then you can go out from the presence of the orange, and you can still imagine the smell of the orange, so that the next time you smell that, you can say, hey, that's an orange. The soul it's like a hard drive that's constantly recording all of this data that's gathered through the senses and storing it. That's the first thing that reason does. Reason is working in the soul through the senses to just collect all of this observational data from the world around us and store it in the soul. That's apprehension, the first act of the soul. Once that's done, now we've got all these simple ideas. They're simple ideas, just these individual things: a dog, an oak tree, a marigold, a tulip, a woman, all of these individual ideas in the soul. The second act of reason is to begin comparing and contrasting them, to begin examining them. And reason does this by nature. This is not a conscious process that we do. Reason does this by itself. Reason begins comparing and contrasting all these things and trying to establish connections between them. So what we see in the second act of reason is judgment, the act of combining or dividing. And what that means is, combining means saying that these two things go together. Dividing means saying that these two things do not go together. Okay, so judgment is the soul, through reason, constantly generating logical propositions, which are called enunciations, which we'll talk about a little more in a bit. But creating propositions which are either true or false, because we can be deceived. Our senses can deceive us, and we can make judgments that are false. We can also make judgments that are true. But reason is constantly doing this, combining things, forming affirmations, separating things, forming negations, constantly doing this, constantly doing the work of judgment in the soul. That's the second act of reason. But notice, these are natural actions. These are natural operations. It's like the natural activity of our muscles. It's not how they're supposed to be. It's just the natural operations as they will work if left to themselves. But that's not how they're supposed to work. Because remember, reason is going to work to order itself once it understands what's going on. So we understand that our souls are already doing these things, but they're not going to do them well. And so we've got to understand what's going on and then sort of take control of this process and start making sure that, things that we perceive them carefully. We pay attention to details and things like that. We've got to make sure that the judgments that are being made in our soul are actually true judgments, and we're not being filled with all kinds of false judgments. So we take responsibility for the care of our soul once we learn what's actually going on. So simple apprehension, that's the first action of the soul. That's what reason does. Judgment, where these simple ideas, or what we call terms later, they're either joined together or separated. Their affirmations are made or negations are made. And then the third thing is reasoning proper. This is what we usually think about when we think about reasoning, this third action of reason in the soul. But this third step assumes that the other two steps are taking place. So this is the end of this process. This is not where it begins. This is where it ends. So we've already got these simple ideas stored up in our souls. We're already joining them together or disjoining them, sometimes truly, sometimes falsely. And then what our soul does after that is it starts to compare those propositions. So now it starts to run these propositions together and ask, does proposition A and proposition B lead to anything? Is there any significance of these two propositions? And reason can discern that two propositions have a certain relationship, which leads to a third proposition, something new. And that's the process of reasoning. Again, that's a natural process. It's not how it's supposed to work, because it's supposed to be directed by the will of a wise man, but it's already doing that, and it can do that falsely. So that's the danger. It's great that it does it, but it can do it falsely, and that's what we have to learn to take care of. So these three acts are taking place in the soul from birth. Right? They obviously become more manifest around age 7 or 8 when we enter the age of reason. But the soul does these things naturally, sometimes truly, sometimes falsely. Through education, in this sense, a man gains an awareness of these processes within himself and takes responsibility for them. He takes control of them, studies the science of rational philosophy, and begins to order his own thoughts. So in the ancient world, when we see people talk about the unlearned people, the masses, the common people, they're the people who just sort of live according to the natural actions of the body and soul. That's how they live. They're like animals, except they also have souls, but their souls aren't rightly governed. So many of the things they do still end up looking like the actions of animals. That's the common people. That's the masses. That's how they're talked about in the ancient world. Whereas the wise man is the one who's working to perfect reason in himself and actually make himself live in harmony with wisdom. So these three acts of reasoning, okay? Apprehension, judgment, and reasoning. And we're going to talk about these much more in the future, but we're just flying over things here. Now, these are things we have to study. In Aristotle's categories, he teaches the science of the first act of reason, which is apprehension. We study apprehension in Aristotle's categories. So again, these aren't random books. This is the science of rational philosophy. The first act, apprehension, Aristotle figured it out, explained it all in the categories. We study the categories to learn the science, and then we get to work ordering our thoughts. Judgment, the second act of the soul, where our soul joins ideas together to form propositions or separates things to form negations. That process, that's called judgment. How does it work? What makes for true propositions? What makes for false propositions? Aristotle explains the science of judgment in his work on interpretation. That's the second book in the study of the science of rational philosophy. Then we come to the third act, and it gets a little more complicated. We come to this act of reasoning, and there's actually a number of different ways in which reasoning works, which we're going to look at in a second. And that leads to a number of different studies that are necessary to deal with these different kinds of reasoning, or these different circumstances in which we reason. So the first two books of the Organon, Categories and On Interpretation, we can see what they're about. In the categories, we learn to understand the act of reason within us of apprehension. On interpretation, we learn to understand judgment, the second act of reason. In the other works, we take up the third act, which is reasoning itself. So we're going to walk through these real quick. Aristotle explains, or St. Thomas is writing this actually, there's a threefold diversity of acts of reasoning with corresponding sciences. So there's three different kinds of reasoning, and they have corresponding sciences by which they're studied. The first one deals with absolute certainty. So we see this phrase, the certitude of science. So there is one type of reasoning that leads us to truths or conclusions that are absolutely certain, scientific truths. Now, this is important because this is the science that Plato and Socrates and Pythagoras didn't have. They didn't know this. Aristotle figured out this science. So this first act of reasoning here, which Aristotle describes, was sort of a mystery to previous philosophers. He's the one that established the science. The first type of reasoning leads to judgments that are scientifically certain. That means they're absolutely certain. They're perfectly true. The first kind of reasoning. And this is called demonstrative reasoning. Demonstrative reasoning. This is why I said before that when people talk about dialectic, most people who talk about it don't know what they're talking about. Dialectic is not a synonym for logic. All of this is logic. This whole rational philosophy, this whole science, everything we see here, can all be called logic. Dialectic is not the same thing as logic. We're going to see in a minute that dialectic is just a part of this, okay? Socrates and Plato understood dialectic. They didn't understand demonstrative reasoning, nor did they understand the sophistical refutations that Aristotle wrote later, because they didn't know demonstrative reasoning. So demonstrative reasoning is the first kind of reasoning that our soul performs. It's reasoning that leads us to truths that are absolutely certain. So if we talk about the philosophical sciences, we talk about natural philosophy as a science, rational philosophy as a science, moral philosophy as a science. What Aristotle is saying is that the things that he teaches in those works are absolutely certain. They're absolutely certain. They're not debatable. There's no debate, no discussion. And in those works, he provides the demonstration that shows them to be absolutely certain. That's what it means to be a science. That's why in modern circles, when we talk about modern natural sciences and there's all this uncertainty and the research changes and the results of the experiments contradict, none of that is science in the sense that Aristotle uses the word science. When Aristotle talks about science, he's talking about knowledge that's systematic and is absolutely certain. So if there's any uncertainty, really technically speaking, that's not science. We'll talk about that all through these studies. So the first kind of reasoning is demonstrative reasoning, where we have an absolute certainty. But there's two different kinds of demonstrative reasoning. One of them can be demonstrated by understanding the form of the argument itself. We consider the form of the syllogism, which is the actual structure of an argument, which again is what our soul does. Our soul was programmed to produce syllogisms, but they can be false. That's the danger of it. We study the form of syllogisms in Aristotle's Prior Analytics. That's the subject of that book, the form of the syllogism. And then in Prior Analytics, we study the effect of the matter along with the form. So the kind of content that we reason from is what makes for demonstrative reasoning. So for example, in classical geometry, the first thing we do in Euclid's Elements is we learn axioms and definitions and postulates. We learn axioms because they're self-evident truths. And because they're self-evident truths, if we start from a self-evident truth and then reason to a conclusion, that conclusion is as certain as that self-evident truth, because the source of it was true. So demonstrative reasoning reasons from propositions that are absolutely certain, and therefore the conclusions are also absolutely certain. So that's the kind of thing we get into in posterior analytics, the second or the fourth book of Aristotle's Organon. So that deals with absolute certainty. What happens, though, when we are not dealing with absolute certainty? This is what Socrates does, okay? Socrates is working in discussions, and think about what Socrates does. He starts arguments, but he doesn't start with absolute truths. He asks people what they think. He says, hey, what do you think? Is man mortal or not? And then whatever the person answers, he takes that and goes with it. Now, usually, this is the significance of these dialogues. The person's answer is like the consensus answer. The person that he speaks with who answers his question doesn't answer questions ridiculously. He usually gives the normal answer that most men would give, the common popular answer. Starting with the common popular answer, we could say, you know what? That's probably true. That's probably why most people hold it. It's probably true. So we're going to deal with a starting proposition that's, possible or probable. And then we're going to reason from it and lead to some conclusions. As we talked about last night, the problem with Plato's dialogues is you almost never get an answer to the question. Why? Because they're not demonstrative. That's why we never get answers from Plato, very rarely. But what Socrates is good at is arguing and leading us into probabilities, where we know that that answer can't possibly be true. That's helpful, but it doesn't tell us what actually is true. It doesn't lead us to science, but it leads us to a position that's probable or likely. Okay, so it's helpful, but it doesn't lead us all the way. So the second kind of reasoning, we come to some confidence in our conclusions, but we know that it's not absolutely certain. And there's two different kinds. First, even though we don't come to absolute scientific certainty, we can still lead someone to come to a certain belief or opinion. It's not scientific, it's not absolutely certain, but it's probable. And there was a saying in ancient times that wise men live according to probability. So you make a decision not based on what's absolutely certain all the time, but based on what's probable or what's likely. So a wise man will usually be content if you can show him that some conclusion is possible when an absolutely certain conclusion can't be found. So this reasoning where we can lead someone to confidence in a probable conclusion, this is what we call dialectical reasoning. This is what dialectic is. Dialectic is reasoning in the realm of what is probable, not scientifically absolutely certain, but probable. That's dialectic. So common everyday discussions where you're arguing with your friends or your neighbors, those discussions are almost always dialectical discussions. And you've got to understand that so you know how to pursue those discussions. Well, where do we learn to do that? We learn about the dialectical syllogism in Aristotle's Topics. So when we hear people talk about the Socratic method is taught in the Topics by Aristotle. That's the Socratic method, dialectical reasoning. Now, we can go even further to a less reliable form of persuasion where it's not as probable or even as certain or likely as what we'd established through dialectical reasoning, but we can just move someone to what's called suspicion, where they doubt another position. And that is pursued through the study of the art of rhetoric. So rhetoric leads us to a certain kind of arguing. It's not of the quality of demonstrative reasoning. We're not going to teach science by means of the art of rhetoric. It's not even as helpful as dialectical reasoning, which we see Socrates doing, which is why if you read Plato's dialogues, Socrates is always criticizing orators because they go on with rambling speeches. And Socrates is basically saying rhetoric is inferior to my dialectic. My dialectic is more effective, criticizing the orators. But rhetoric is helpful in that it can lead us or lead others to a point of suspicion, it's called, and we'll get into this when we study rhetoric. But it's still a lower quality of argumentation than dialectic. And lastly, poetry. Aristotle wrote the Poetics because poetry can also be a means of persuasion by simply describing something in a way that moves someone to make a certain decision or conclusion. Like if we're sitting down for dinner and, whoever is preparing dinner made hot dogs, and at the table I say, you know that hot dogs are made of all the leftover garbage shoveled up off the floor in the meat processing plants, and then no one wants to eat the hot dog. I just persuaded everyone to avoid the hot dog by means of what Aristotle would call poetry. It was by means of a description that led people to a certain conclusion. There was no argument. I simply described it in a certain way, and the description had an effect on the people. That's poetry. So that's the second kind of reasoning, dialectical reasoning. And then lastly, reasoning that actually fails, that's actually false, which is sophistry. Sophistry is reasoning. It looks like reasoning. The soul is reasoning, and it produces what appears to be a syllogism, but it actually does not work. It's a false or invalid argument. And there's a number of reasons why it can be wrong, because of the truth or falsehood of the propositions, or because of problems in the reasoning itself. So sophistry is false reasoning, but it can still be persuasive because people don't recognize that it's false. And sophists are people who use intentionally false arguments because they appear to be true to deceive people. That's sophistry. It's a form of reasoning, and it is persuasive even though it's false. So this is what we would consider any kind of deception. Deception is sophistry. Well, this is studied in Aristotle's Sophistical Refutations, where he not only identifies these false arguments, but destroys them for us and shows us what's wrong with them. So that all of those books that Aristotle wrote, these are all the books of classical reasoning and rhetoric. It's a library that teaches the whole science of rational philosophy. That's what Aristotle was actually doing. He wrote the whole science of rational philosophy. And, it was wrongly used through much of history. St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Albert the Great got hold of it and freed it from misuse and false interpretation, and established it as the official philosophy of the Catholic community. So that's where scholasticism comes from. If we want to learn rational philosophy, we want to order our souls with respect to reasoning, that's the curriculum to do it. There's no mystery, no confusion, no uncertainty. We've got a list of the books that need to be studied. We have an explanation of what benefit each of them offers us. It's just a matter of work to do these studies. So that's all for rational philosophy. Now, if we jump back to that second document, the overview of philosophy, you can see that what we just went over is this second of the four sciences here. The second of these relations between order and reason, the science of rational philosophy. So tomorrow night, we'll look at moral philosophy, which is up next. And then on Thursday night, we'll do natural philosophy. And my goal for these classes, and I know this is an ambitious goal, but once we've got this map prepared for us, I just want to go through these books and actually learn these sciences and just continue cycling through them, reading them, discussing them. As we read one, compare it to things we read in the others, because they all influence each other, because they all came from one person. So there's one spirit in all of these works. And as we read them, we're going to find that, Aristotle interprets Aristotle, but we've got to get through all of them. So having said that, it's 10:04. I have run my course and was able to get through that. So thanks for bearing with me. That's our map for these studies. there's a lot more to talk about, but at least we know the plan, and now we can just get to work on it in future weeks. All right. So thanks for bearing with me through that. What I'll do is I'll post the recording of this video, and then I'll put links on the YouTube recording to these documents. So if you're ever looking for these documents, you can just go to YouTube, find the video, and get the links there. I think that's the easy way to do it for everyone. But that's it. So we should understand, starting with Socrates and Plato. We should be able to start with Socrates and Plato, understood what they taught and what the philosophers before them taught, how we ascend to the good through mathematical sciences. Then see Socrates and Plato promoting this thing called dialectic, which is good. And we can understand when we get into rational philosophy what it is. But then Aristotle just blows things up and establishes the whole philosophical system, especially for rational philosophy. Once he figures out demonstrative reasoning in prior and posterior analytics, once he figures that out, he just takes that weapon and goes to work on the other sciences. And that's how we get the natural philosophical sciences, the moral philosophical sciences, and so on. That's why Aristotle is able to do it all. It all comes through rational philosophy, true rational philosophy being figured out. All right, so that's that. Hope that's helpful. If there's anything you'd like to talk about, I'll hang out and talk about it, but I'm going to stop the recording there, and then we're free to do whatever we want. Let me stop sharing here. Stop recording.